I'm Dr. Kavitha Yadav. Today's session is with regarding to types of swaps. Let's know more about types of swaps. See, first of all, what is swap means? Where swap is basically an exchange agreement between the parties concerned. There are wide variety of swaps available in the market for the hedgers to hedge their risk. See, few among those are interest rate swaps, currency swaps, commodity swap, asset swap, and credit default swap. The first one is the interest rate swap. So it is an agreement between two parties to exchange the nature of interest payments. There are two types of cash flows. A fixed rate payer makes fixed payments, whereas the floating rate payer makes payment based on the benchmark Libro interest rate we tell. Since the fixed payment is known, it is paid at the outset of swap, but the floating rate payment is made at some future date. Then we have got currency swap. See, a currency swap helps to manage exchange rate risk primarily. It involves an exchange of debt service obligation denominated in one currency to another. This swap is based on the principle of comparative advantage. Each party picks up the currency it has a comparative advantage in and exchanges it with the other party availing the same advantage but in a different currency. Thus, one hand it lowers the cost of serving the debt, and on the other hand it reduces the foreign exchange exposure. So the currency swap normally involves a series of periodic payments in the future. Then you have got commodity swaps. This kind of swap is generally used by producers and consumers to hedge commodity prices. This swap generally involves an exchange of fixed and floating payment. So usually the consumer would make the fixed price payment to hedge against price rise in future, and the producer would take floating payment to hedge against the fall in the price of the commodity in exchange for receiving a fixed price for the commodity. Then you have got asset swap. See, an asset swap is a combination of defaultable bond with a fixed for floating interest rate swap. In this, the dealer buys a bond from one customer at the market price and sells it to another customer at a floating rate note at par. The dealer then hedges himself from floating rate obligation by entering into another deal with a counterparty for fixed flows. Okay, such swaps are called as asset swaps. Then you have got credit default swap. See, it is a swap that provides the holder the protection against a credit loss. This swap is used when a hedge is sought for any asset which is vulnerable to a specific credit event. That is, a hedger may seek a credit default swap for a bond, a loan, etc. when he is fearing credit downgrade. Apart from these, there are many other variants like the equity swap, total return swap, trigger swap, etc., which are available in the market. So these are different types of swaps that should be known if dealings have to be done with regarding to swaps. Then you have got types of interest rate swaps. The first interest rate swaps. See, an interest rate swap is a contractual agreement between two parties under which each agrees to make a periodic payment to the other for an agreed period of time based upon a notional amount of principal. See, the principal amount is notional because there is no need to exchange actual amounts of principal when there is no foreign exchange component to be taken into account of. However, a notional amount of principal is required in order to compute the actual cash amounts that will be periodically exchanged. Okay, so this is what is interest rate swaps. There are two types, that is fixed for floating interest rate swap and floating interest rate swap. See, fixed for floating interest rate. Under the commonest form of interest rate swap, a series of payments are calculated by applying a fixed rate of interest to a notional principal amount. It is exchanged for a stream of payments similarly calculated but using a floating rate of interest. This is fixed for floating interest rate swap. Secondly, floating interest rate swap. In this kind of swap, both series of cash flows to be exchanged are calculated using floating rates of interest, but floating rates that are based upon different underlying indices like Libor or MIFOR. Next you have got currency swaps. There are different types of currency swaps. See, what is currency swap means? A currency swap involves an exchange of two payments denominated into two different currencies. A currency swap is a contract which commits two counterparties to an exchange over an agreed period, two streams of payments in different currencies, each calculated using a different interest rate, and an exchange at the end of the period of the corresponding principal amounts at an exchange rate agreed at the start of the contract. Okay, so there are different types of currency swap such as par swap. If the principal amount is exchanged right in the beginning, then it is called par swap. Cross currency coupon swaps means in these swaps the exchange of the interest amount is fixed against floating interest rates. Then you have got cross currency basis swap. These swaps involve payments attached to a floating rate index for both the currencies. In other words, it is a floating against floating cross currency basis swap. See, these are the different types of currency swap, and there are some advantages of swaps too, which are: the first one, the investors, which are corporate, will have an access to the markets in which it is impossible to raise debt directly. For instance, the companies with lower credit rating may not have access to fixed rate funds but can arrange fixed rate funds through swaps. See, swaps can be used as a long hedge instrument. Use of swaps provides an opportunity to restructure a firm's capital profile without physically redeeming debt or raising new debt. What are the disadvantages of swap means? Firstly, if we have to know the disadvantages, firstly, difficulty in finding a counterpart with opposite cash flow obligation who could enter for a swap deal. Secondly, termination of swap contract requires mutual consent of both the parties. Since the swaps deals are private bilateral contracts traded on OTC and not exchange traded, they necessarily involve an inherent default risk by any of the contracting party. Swaps are not easily tradable because the secondary market in swap deals are not fully developed worldwide, which is primarily because of slow progress of standardized documentation. Swap contracts are decided on the basis of comparative advantage theory. This theory involves one party with floating rate obligation attached to a short-term benchmark rate and another party with relatively long-term fixed rate obligations. While the short-term benchmark rate can be adjusted and changed when credit rating of the party changes, but the long rate cannot be adjusted to change in the party's credit rating. So these and all we can list as the disadvantages of swaps. Thank you.